Hi everyone, I'm London, and today I'm going to show you everything you need to know to make your own soy container candles at home. I've been making my own container candles in my own business, Particle Goods, for about 3 years now, and I love the versatility of soy wax. I'm so excited to partner with Brambleberry because I've been using their products since the beginning, and they just all have exceptional quality. All right, let's get started. Today we're going to be working with Golden Brand's 464 soy wax flakes, but we also carry the Nature Wax C3 soy flakes as well. Now, soy is a natural wax. It's derived from the soybean oil, so it's a really great wax to start with because it's versatile, it's really affordable, and it's inexpensive too. I also like that soy is considered a clean burning wax, which means that it's not going to emit chemicals into the air like paraffin will, and it's also much less likely to soot. In fact, 90% less likely to soot than paraffin. So what that means is you won't end up with all of those gross black marks on your upholstery or your walls. And then most importantly, for someone like me who likes to get really creative but tends to be a little messy, I like that soy is water soluble. So when we're done here, we can clean things up with soap and water or a little isopropyl alcohol, and it just makes everything a breeze. Some features to look for when choosing a soy wax would be a high fragrance load, something around 10% or higher. You also want to look for good glass adhesion and a strong cold and hot throw. We've all had a candle that smells great in the store and then we get it home and it just doesn't smell like anything. So you want to make sure that your soy wax is going to be capable of producing a really highly fragrant candle. Now you'll find several kinds of soy wax on the market, and you may be wondering what's the best type of soy for your container project. More than likely they'll all work, but you'll want to do your own testing to find what soy is going to be best for you. Some soy is 100% pure soy, and some may be blended with other vegetable waxes as well. Now I'm going to tell you to test everything today. Every step of the way you're going to want to keep notes, make sure that you're keeping a log of all the things that you try. Test everything, test it twice, and then probably test it again. The first step is choosing a container. Now, soy works really well for container candles, but you want to keep in mind that soy burns at a really high temperature, so you need a container that's able to withstand a lot of heat. That makes something like glass, ceramic, or metal a really suitable container for your candle making. Now, I would also look at the shape of the container. Things that can be irregularly shaped, like having a more narrow base with a taller bottom, might create a few troubleshooting issues when you're wicking, but overall, these all look like great containers. One thing I would stay away from, even though it's glass, might be something like a wine glass or a really curvy vase that's likely to topple over and spill wax, or worse, catch your house on fire. Now, things that I would recommend not using for candle making would be something like this guy. This looks really convincing. It's a cute jar, it looks like it's glass, but it's actually plastic, and plastic is not suitable for candle making. It's prone to melting, it could catch on fire, and at the very least, it's going to emit some really yucky chemicals into the air. I would also not recommend materials that are porous, such as wood or maybe terracotta. Those aren't going to work very well for your container candles either. Other than that, feel free to pick a container that gives your candle a little bit of personality. We want it to be something that you're excited about and feels really special. If you need some inspiration, go look at the new candle containers on brambleberry.com. Once you've chosen a container, the next step is to choose your wick. Now, before you can pick the wick, you have to make sure that you've narrowed in on your container because that's going to determine what wick size will work best for you. Now, there are lots of different wicks that work well for soy candle making. You can use a wood wick like this one. This is the narrow wood wick. You can also use a paper or cotton core wick, and these are going to be based on braided fibers. So the larger the wick size, the more of those fibers that are braided together. Now, a larger wick is going to create a larger flame, which will give you a wider melt pool. And melt pool is really important in burning your candle because that ensures that you're going to be able to melt the candle all the way to the edge of your container. So we're thinking about wick sizes in terms of the diameter and the overall shape of our container. If you've got a container that's really evenly shaped and it doesn't have any curvature, that should be a pretty easy container to size. Now, you can run into a lot of troubles when you're looking for the perfect size wick. Some of those might be finding a wick that ends up being too big and one that ends up being too small. If your wick is too small, it won't be able to achieve a full melt pool, and it's probably going to tunnel a little bit like this one. So you can see around the edges of the glass container, that wick is not able to consume all the fuel. So it's leaving a lot of that wax residue built up around the side. And this is important because soy has what's called a memory, which means it can only burn as far as the last burn. So this is gonna waste a lot of our wax. We're not gonna be able to burn the whole candle, and that's a real bummer. So this is definitely caused by a wick that's improperly sized, but this can also be caused by improper burning technique. Make sure that you burn your candle long enough that it can reach a full melt pool. If you don't do that, then you're gonna end up with tunneling as well. My rule is that it takes about 1 hour per inch in diameter to reach a full melt pool. So when you're testing your wicks and finding the right size, that's a really good metric to use. If you're reaching a full melt pool before that, your wick might be too large, and that may cause some issues like you see with these candles. These wicks are burning a little bit hot. They are achieving a full melt pool, so it seems like those are correctly sized, but you'll notice that the flame is pretty tall, it's really moving around and dancing, and you're getting a lot of mushrooming or carbon buildup. So that's what's happening on the ends of these wicks. They've got these tiny little carbon balls that are actually over-consuming that candle wax. So this is not gonna work very well. Your container might get really hot, and you may end up with some black sooting around the top there. Oversizing your wick may also lead to a really weak scent throw, so that can be problematic as well. As with all things, this is something you really need to test, and my best suggestion is to test a couple different wick sizes for your wax at one time. I like to start by filling the container about half full to test my wick, and the reason that I do that instead of starting at the top is because your container is also going to insulate some of that heat. So as my candle burns down, some of that glass is going to help melt the wax inside of my container, and that may mean that my wax gets consumed a little quicker at that point. So start from about halfway up and work your way down. That way, if you have a container like this one or this guy where it's really narrow at the top and wide at the bottom, that way you can find the appropriate sized wick. Keep a log, write down the right wick size, and then go from there. Okay, so let's talk about the steps involved in making your candle. The first thing we want to do is set up a wax melter. Now, today we're going to be using this double broiler. You can whip this up with what you already have at home, and in fact, that's how I started making candles, just right in my kitchen. You need a large pot filled about halfway full of water, and we're going to bring that to a low simmer. You can also use a smaller pot nested on top of that, or you can use something like this. This is actually a pouring pitcher that I brought with me. I love this pitcher because it's really lightweight. It also has a plastic handle, which means when I set it into my double boiler, that handle won't be too hot for me to lift it out. And then most importantly, I like this for this nice tapered spout. This will ensure that I can get a really nice, clean pour into my containers. So we're using the Golden 464 soy wax today. We've already measured out 2 pounds of wax, and I'm gonna go ahead and put that into my pitcher and start melting. I never said I would be graceful. So one of the reasons we're going to use a double broiler today is because we want to be able to monitor that temperature really closely, and this should allow us to melt the wax completely without overheating it. Soy needs to stay under 200 degrees Fahrenheit, otherwise it can start to yellow or discolor. So you can heat soy wax in the microwave in something like a glass container in really short bursts, but you're probably going to overheat it. It might be a little harder to monitor that temperature. So if you can do it in a double broiler, I think that's absolutely the easiest way to go. So we're just gonna pop our pouring pitcher right into our double broiler. Make sure that the water isn't at a rolling boil. You want it to be simmering, but you don't want it to splash up on you or splash into your wax pot. We're gonna let this sit until that wax melts and reaches 185 degrees, at which point we can add our fragrance. While our wax is melting, let's talk a little bit about some of the other equipment that you'll have in your kitchen that could be really handy in candle making. I like to use a digital scale. And this ensures that I'm using consistent measurements for my wax and for my fragrance. It's really important to go by weight versus volume in candle making to make sure that you're using the appropriate amount. I also like to have either a silicone spatula or a wooden spoon on hand. I like the silicone because it's really easy to clean and it won't absorb any fragrance. So make sure you've got something to incorporate your fragrance oil into the wax. And then probably most importantly, you need something to measure the temperature. This is just a digital meat thermometer, and I really like it because it has a big display so I can really see those numbers from a couple of feet away. And it has this nice bendable arm. So this is handy if I want to just pop that right onto the side of my pouring pitcher, and I can keep an eye on things as I'm over here preparing other parts of our container. So while your wax is melting, let's kind of step over here and talk a little bit about fragrance. Now, fragrances are undoubtedly the most exciting part of candle making for me. I love blending different fragrances and thinking about the way that they relate to other people or memory. There's a lot of really cool things you can do with fragrance oils. Now, the most common questions I get about fragrances are, what type of fragrances should I use in candle making, and how much fragrance oil should I use in candle making? So let's start with the first one. There's a lot of options out there, but one of the things I want you to think about first is to make sure that when you're looking at fragrance oils, that you're looking at fragrances specifically formulated for candle making. Make sure they don't have ingredients that are flammable, like alcohol or dipropylene glycol. Those would be really dangerous, and they're not going to bond well with your wax anyway. If you look on Brambleberry's website, you can find a ton of really amazing fragrance oils. That was actually how I found Brambleberry in the first place. And one of the things you can find is a lot of really good information, reviews, and my favorite part, you can find the flash points right there on the product description page. Now, the flash point of a fragrance helps you understand how dense that fragrance oil might be. Remember, our soy wax burns at a pretty hot temperature, so we need to have a fragrance oil that can withstand a lot of heat. Our candle has to get pretty hot in order to release the fragrance oil. So a flash point tells you at what temperature a fragrance may start to evaporate. Now, most fragrance oils have a higher flash point of around 180 to 200 degrees, but you will find some that are lower. I would say for the purposes of beginning, stick with some of those higher flash point fragrances. Those are going to hold up better in your wax because they're denser oils and they'll be able to give you a really strong scent throw. That being said, we've all fallen in love with a specific fragrance oil and felt just bound and determined to make it work. So if you find a fragrance oil that has a lower flash point, go ahead and try it, but here are some tips that I would say to make sure you're fully incorporating it. Unlike our higher flash point oil where we're going to add it at 185, I would say add those lower oils at whatever their flash point is. So if your flash point of your fragrance is 155, you're going to add that when the wax is also 155 or lower. That way you're not evaporating all of your fragrance oil. So those are some tips to help you choose the right kind of fragrance oil. Otherwise, it's really personal preference. I tend to like a fragrance oil that's kind of neutral and subtle. So my personal favorite from Brambleberry is probably the tobacco and bay leaf fragrance. If you haven't tried that, and I know most of you have, it's a really beautiful, neutral, soft, herbaceous scent, and it's one that I just want my house to smell like all the time. So once you've selected a fragrance oil, you're gonna have to figure out how much fragrance oil you should use. The best place to start is to look at the manufacturer of your wax and find out what they recommend. All soy wax has a maximum fragrance load capacity. So kind of think of your soy wax like a giant sponge. It can only absorb and hold so much of that fragrance oil in before it's just gonna start to leach out. Now, most soy wax has a maximum fragrance capacity of around 10 to 12%, but that doesn't mean you should start by adding that much to begin with. I would say a good ratio to begin with is actually about 6%. If you're using a really high quality fragrance oil, you probably don't need the full maximum fragrance load capacity. And it's a really easy measurement to remember. 6% is going to give you a ratio of 1 pound of soy wax and 1 ounce of fragrance oil. So as with everything that we've said today, make sure you test. You'll find that some fragrances just don't do well at all for candle making. They may not be particularly formulated for candle making. Their flash point may be too low. So there's a lot of reasons a fragrance oil wouldn't work, but definitely testing. That's going to give you the best estimate of how a fragrance might perform in your soy wax. Let's go ahead and check the temperature of our wax now. All right, and we have quite a ways to go. Now, candle making is often a lesson in patience, and just like cooking, you have to wait for the right time and temperature. So I'm gonna just go in here and break up some of the clumps that have formed. Because we're using a wax in flake form, oftentimes it'll kind of clump together and form just a really big blob, which means there's less surface area and it's not gonna melt as quickly. So go ahead and just gently break up some of those chunks. If you're not at a low simmer, also a good time to turn your temperature up. And then we're gonna let that sit for another few minutes. Our wax is just about at that 185-degree temperature that we're looking for. So while I'm waiting, I'm just gonna go ahead and measure my fragrance oil now. So I've got my measuring cup and I'm gonna tare it on my digital scale so that I don't account for the weight. And then I'm gonna weigh out that 8% usage rate of our tobacco and bay leaf, which comes out to about 2.5 ounces. Perfect. So let's check on our wax. And we're at 184. We're right there on the edge. So we'll give it one more second to come up 1 degree. It would probably be fine if we did it at 184. So once your wax has reached the proper mixing temperature, you want to go ahead and remove it from the heat because you don't want your fragrance oil to evaporate. So now we're ready to incorporate our fragrance. So I'm going to pour the fragrance oil in and then just gently but continuously stir for about 1 to 2 minutes. Stirring too quickly can cause some issues in your candle. For example, stirring too fast will incorporate a lot of extra air into the wax, and that can result in things like cratering or sinkholes in your candle, and that may pose some problems with how it burns later on. So you definitely don't want to stir too quickly. And then once we're done stirring, we're gonna let this sit and cool down to the proper pour temp. Now, just like everything else, sometimes your pour temperature can vary. This is something you'll wanna test, but I always like to start with whatever the manufacturer recommends. For Golden Soy 464, you want a pour temperature right around 135 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty low. A good visual cue is that that's right about when the wax starts to look cloudy. So I think I've incorporated all my fragrance oil. And I'm just gonna take my digital thermometer and stick that right in there so I can make sure I keep an eye on that as the temperature comes down. While my wax is cooling, I'm gonna come over and start preparing my containers. These are new glass votives from brambleberry.com, and I love that they come in this totally like unique array of colors. You've got the amber glass, the green, and then this really nice frosted container. So all of these containers are going to give you a nice diffused light when you're burning, and they're kind of the perfect size to just pop around your house or to give someone as maybe a new house gift. All right, we need to put the wick into each of these containers while our wax is cooling. And I'm going to show you a couple of different kinds of wicks. Now, the first one that we're going to use today is the narrow wooden wick, and this actually has a second piece of wood laminated to it. So this is a wooden wick with what's called a booster. This is going to help create a really nice wide melt pool, and if you've never used a wooden whack, it adds that nice little crackle, almost like sitting next to the fireplace. So combined with our nice soft glow container, this is going to be a really good combination. Now, all wood wicks work the same way. They come with this metal clip, and you're just gonna slide the wick right into the clip. Super easy. And then I need a way to attach that wick to the bottom of the container. You could just set it in there, but likely what will happen is as your candle burns down and it gets really hot, that wick isn't going to stay centered and it may not burn evenly. So I'm gonna use some wick stickers to adhere my wicks to the bottom of my container. So wick stickers are something that I use. Now, this is just one way that you can attach your wick to your container, and I would encourage you to try all the different options and find out what works for you. You can use a glue dot, you can use a glue gun, although you want to be careful as some glue can melt at higher temperatures. For the wick sticker, we're just going to stick it to the bottom of the wick clip and then press it firmly into the center of the container. And I'll go ahead and repeat that for a couple of our other containers. Perfect. So we've got 3 wood wicks here, and then I'm also going to use some of the HTP 93 braided wicks. Now, these are a cotton core wick. They have lots of threads braided together, and this should be about the right size to make sure we create a full melt pool, but that it's not going to be too hot as the base starts to narrow here at the bottom. And I'm going to attach those the same way. Now, with your cotton and paper wicks, you will need a way to securely hold that wick in place. The wood wick's going to stand up on its own, but as you can see, that cotton wick is going to start to lean, and we want to make sure it stays upright and centered when our wax is in our container. You might actually have some things around your kitchen that would allow you to secure those wicks in place. Some leftover chopsticks, a popsicle stick, a clothespin, lots of really great, easy options. I'm all about repurposing things. Doesn't have to be technical and fancy. I'm also going to show you some wick clip holders that you can try. All right, all of our wicks are secured in our container. Let's check the temperature of our wax. We want that temperature to read about 135. And right now we're still at 160. So we've got a little ways to go, and that's okay. So as we're waiting for our wax to cool down, you might be wondering, why did we have to heat it to such a high temperature? Now, the way that wax and fragrance bond together is that we want to heat the wax higher than the melting point so that all of those wax molecules can fully expand. What's going to happen is as we blend our fragrance oil into the wax, all of those wax molecules will then encapsulate the fragrance molecules and they'll kind of trap them inside. So heating it up to 185 degrees just ensures that we can really fully incorporate that fragrance oil. If you want to try mixing your fragrance in at a lower temperature, you can certainly do that. As with anything, I think testing is really the best way to decide what temperature works best for your own process. So it looks like we're right at the perfect pouring temperature, 135 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm going to go ahead and pour my containers. Get my spatula out of there. And you want to pour just slow and steady into your container. I'm going to leave about a 1/2 to a 1/4 inch room at the top of each container. It's good to make sure you don't overfill your candles or they can overflow as they're melting. So just take your time. Pouring too quickly will give you lots of air bubbles, and you don't want that. As we talked about, that can cause sinkholes and other cratering issues. So we're just going to pour nice and slow. Perfect. Now we have just a tiny bit of wax left in there, and that's okay. Sometimes I like to keep that on hand just in case the tops don't look perfect and I want to do a second pour. You could also pop that back into your double boiler and just clean out some of the residue. Now, the last thing we need to do is just make sure all of our wicks are centered and secured. Our wood wicks all look really good. I'm going to take this metal bow tie wick clip and I'm going to use that to secure some of my wicks, my cotton wicks. Now, you don't have to use the bow tie wick clip. This is just one option out there. I like it because it has these small notches that allow for me to just really easily pull that wick tight and fold it down. And then I'm going to show you an alternative method that might be a little easier for you. Stuff that you'll have in your kitchen already. Popsicle sticks are another great option. You can take 2 popsicle sticks or chopsticks and just kind of sandwich the wick together. Make sure that it's centered, but that should hold it nice and upright. Now, once you've got all of your wicks centered, you want to make sure that you set your candles aside and allow them to cool completely. This should be at least 24 hours without touching them, and make sure they're in a nice temperature controlled room. Don't put them in your garage where the temperature is going to drop overnight, as that can change the cooling process of your candle and cause some aesthetic issues. Now, I also like to let my candles sit for an additional 3 to 5 days, and that's what we call curing for soy candles. Some candle makers cure their candles for 2 weeks. Other soy candle makers don't cure them at all. I find that just giving the wax and the fragrance a couple more days to fully bond and make friends inside the candle jar is going to give me the best performance. As with everything else, testing is going to help you determine what works best for you. So while our candles are cooling, let's talk about some of the imperfections or issues you might encounter when you're first learning to make soy container candles. The first ones we'll talk about are purely visual and won't actually harm the function of your candle. One of the most common issues you'll find really noticeably with soy is this issue called frosting. Now, frosting has to do with temperature, the rate at which your wax is cooling, and all of those fatty vegetable chains are forming in either a really tight or really loose crystalline structure. Now, frosting looks like tiny little snowflakes on the surface of your wax. Certainly more noticeable when you're using a dyed wax like we did for our succulent mold here. If you're using plain natural soy wax, you may not notice it as much. Or if you're using a container like the amber glass or a frosted container, you really won't notice the frosting. Once your candle has frosted, there really isn't a way to fix it, so don't try to go in with your heat gun and heat over the top of it. You'll actually make that problem worse. Again, your candle is going to smell amazing. It should burn just fine. This is purely an aesthetic issue, and it's one that's really common with soy. Another issue that you might find is something like cratering or sinkholes just on the surface of your candle. That'll look a little bit like this. Now, these are usually caused by air pockets in your wax, which could either be caused by stirring too quickly, or it could be caused by pouring too quickly, and it can also just be caused by the temperature that you're pouring at. If your candle cools too quickly, then it's pulling some of that wax down, especially in the center. That's usually where you will notice that. Now, you could technically fix this. You could go in with your heat gun and heat over the top and smooth that out. The other thing that I found works really well and takes a little less time is just to use some of your leftover wax that you may have saved and give it a second pour. So you can heat that up just to your nice pouring temperature, top that off, and that'll create a really nice smooth surface. You do want to make sure you fix this before you burn your candle for the first time. Otherwise, it may not achieve a full wax melt pool. So that's really important. Other issues that I've encountered, especially after burning, is you burn your candle, everything seems great, and then once it kind of cools down and hardens again, it looks really bumpy on the surface. It can look kind of unsightly, but I promise you it's just fine. There's nothing wrong with your candle. It's just another property of soy wax. It doesn't always form that structure perfectly smooth once it's been burned. Now, something like this candle, which shows a little bit of discoloration, this may also seem alarming, but again, just a visual imperfection. You may have discoloration over time as your candle ages. It's going to be really sensitive to UV light, so that could discolor your candle. Fragrance oils that you use, especially those that have vanilla in them, will also discolor your candle. And then if you're burning a candle and the wick is too hot, you may get some discoloration from the wax reaching a higher temperature than it wants to be at. Now, the last issue that you may see is called delamination or wet spots. It's basically where your wax pulls away from the sides of the container. This is really only noticeable if you're using a clear container. So if you're using the frosted or the amber glass, you're not going to notice this at all because you can't see the side of the container. What happens here is you have wax that's shrinking as it's cooling and glass that's expanding when it gets hot. So you just have two different factors to contend with. I promise you that you could spend time trying to fix this, but if you go into any big name store, you're going to see that same issue on all the professional candles, even the really expensive ones. So just know that every time you make a candle, it's really special, even if it doesn't look perfect. Now, these are all visual issues that aren't going to affect the function of your candle, but let's talk about some of the issues you might have that will affect the function of your candle. Probably the most concerning issue you'll run into when candle making is a lack of hot throw. Now remember, cold throw is how your candle smells when it's unlit. Hot throw is how your candle smells when it's lit. So you want a good, strong scent throw with both. You should be able to pick up your candle when it's unlit and get a sense of how that candle smells. And while it's lit, it should be able to fill a small space with that fragrance. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you have to allow your candle to reach a full melt pool in order to get good scent throw. That's where your fragrance is coming from. Your wax has to heat up to release that fragrance into the air. So if you're not achieving a full melt pool, odds are you're not going to get a very strong hot throw. So that's the easiest explanation. Some of the other explanations are a little bit more technical and may require more testing. The first one would be the fragrance itself. So we talked a lot earlier in this video about what fragrances are suitable for candle making, and sometimes there's just no way to know exactly how your fragrance will perform until you put it in your candle and you burn it. Now, the fragrance itself might be the issue. We talked about those flash points. It could also be your fragrance usage. If you didn't add enough fragrance, you may be experiencing weak hot throw, but if you added too much fragrance, you may also be experiencing really weak hot throw because it's too much fragrance for that wick to consume. Now, I found that in most cases, a weak hot throw is usually caused by improper burning technique, not achieving a full melt pool, or an improperly sized wick. This is where your testing really comes in handy. If you're experiencing weak throw, try a wick size that's higher and a wick size that's lower. For those lower flash point fragrances, you'll likely need a smaller wick size than you do with the higher ones because you need less heat for that fragrance to be evaporated. These are just some of the things you can try. I would encourage you to do all the experiments you can, but hopefully some of these tips have given you a little bit more confidence to just get in there and play around with soy candles in your own kitchen. If you need more advice or tips on how to troubleshoot your soy candles, read my article linked in the description below that I wrote for Brambleberry. As always, if you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I'm so excited I got to share this with you today, and I hope you subscribe to the Brambleberry channel where you can get more tips and tricks from the experts. Thank you. See you next time.